I think we're about ready to begin. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I appreciate it. We may have a few other latecomers, so we'll leave the back door open. Wordsworth wrote these lines. I think many of us are familiar with them. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. As director of the Nanovic Institute, I feel like that's what we do with our days quite a bit. We're getting and spending and forgetting what's really important. But today we're here to bestow the Laura Shannon Prize. And the Laura Shannon Prize is really what we're all about. It captures really the core of our being and our mission, supporting scholarship, celebrating European studies, and disseminating knowledge. It brings so many strands of our purpose together. It's just a delight to do that. We get to celebrate a great work of scholarship and give away a ton of money. What better way to spend your afternoon? But before we get to that matter in particular, I do want to do a little getting and spending. I want to make a few announcements, especially to those of my colleagues here who may be interested in a few opportunities sponsored by the Nanovic Institute. One is the Berlin Seminar in Transnational European Studies, to be held from May 31st to June 6th. In Berlin. That's for faculty and advanced graduate students. So please look at our website for further information. We'd love to have more representation if that's of interest to you. So has anyone in this group been part of it yet? Then it's time you did. You're pointing to somebody, but Heather is not admitting it. So if you're in any doubt about the high quality of this event or this week's seminar, ask Heather. She'll say yes. The other thing that I wanted to let you know about is something that I don't think is yet posted, but if not, it will be coming soon. And that is a new scheme launched by the Nanovic Institute to support the creation of European studies courses, particularly courses that fit into the new curriculum, or still relatively new curriculum, in the categories of integration and CAD, Catholicism, and the disciplines. And so what we're doing is offering $2,500 to your research fund for anyone who puts forward a serious proposal with a draft syllabus. So please do that. Take advantage of that support. We'd love you to be part of that. I think both those are really great projects. So the Laura Shannon Prize. As you know, it doesn't go to just one book. This year, we're actually celebrating 3 books. And in addition to the winner of the main prize, there are 2 honorable mentions. John Boland's book on British Islam, Religion, Law, and Everyday Practice in Sharia Councils won an honorable mention, as did Yuri Slezkin's The House of Government, a saga of the Russian Revolution. I cringed when I said his last name because I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. But anyway, both of these books received thorough praise from the committee and deserve also our applause. They're great accomplishments. Neither of the authors are with us, but I wanted to mention that as we begin. The Laura Shannon Prize wouldn't be possible without the work of so many of my colleagues. The final jury consisted of Jeffrey Anderson from Georgetown, John Merriman from Yale University, and Susan Peterson from Columbia, and our own colleagues, Ruth Abbey and Alex Martin. I want to offer my heartfelt gratitude to you. Before the books get to the final jury, they've been read by numbers of colleagues. And so I would ask any of you who have participated in this process to raise your hand. I know John has, I have. Don't be shy. Mark has. Come on, you know if you've done it. At any rate, I thank you as well, and all the colleagues who are absent. I know Vittorio has read for us in the past, and many others. Without your participation, the Notre Dame colleagues, this would not be possible. So thank you all. Why don't we give them a round of applause? Now the actual, substantive, real introduction of our honored guest this evening will be given by my friend and colleague, the historian Mark Cutler, who we're happy to say is a postdoctoral fellow in the Nanovic Institute. Mark Cutler. Leave it for him. Very good.
Good evening and welcome. As Bill mentioned, my name is Mark Cutler. I'm a postdoctoral research associate here at the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and tonight it will be my honor to introduce the recipient of this year's Laura Shannon Prize. Before we begin, however, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize all of the staff and fellows of the Nanovic Institute who made this event possible. Melanie Webb and Jennifer Arosio deserve special thanks for coordinating tonight's events, as do Monica Caro and Connor Brand for organizing and shepherding the selection process for the prize. So please join me in thanking them. The Laura Shannon Prize is awarded each year to the best book that transcends a focus on any one country, state, or people to stimulate new ways of thinking about contemporary Europe as a whole. Given this description, it may seem curious at first to bestow this year's prize on Max Bergholz's Violence as a Generative Force, Identity, Nationalism, and Memory in a Balkan Community. After all, it centers on Kulin Vakuf, a small region in the west of the independent state of Croatia. Indeed, it focuses intently on a few months in the autumn of 1941, when neighbors who had generally lived peacefully in multi-ethnic communities suddenly perpetrated a series of horrific massacres and reprisals which claimed the lives of hundreds of men, women, and children. Readers quickly discover, however, the profound implications of this study for how we understand, even how we talk about, instances of mass violence against civilians, both in Europe and globally. Many accounts of mass violence or ethnic conflict default to a basic explanatory shortcut. They assume on some level that the outbreak of mass violence among neighbors can be reliably and meaningfully attributed to deeply held ethnic grievances, prejudices, and hatreds between very distinct communities. This is a rather comforting explanation for outside observers. It allows us to imagine that mass violence can only occur, among peoples torn by decades of unresolved strife, among nationally atomized communities, or, as we sometimes call them, Balkanized societies. Mass violence happens over there. We are safe. By deftly analyzing the escalation of mass violence in Kulin Vakuf, Bergholz arrives at an unsettling but important conclusion. He demonstrates that ideological indoctrination, deep ethnic cleavages, and long-nurtured hatreds often played little role in motivating those who actually perpetrated killing locally. Instead, violence itself recast social relations among neighbors in Kulin Vakuf, shearing multi-ethnic communities and stealing previously malleable ethnic identities. Bergholz also directs our attention away from staid debates about the intention and premeditation of mass violence. Once unleashed, mass violence in Kulin Vakuf provoked a dynamic of escalation difficult to foresee and impossible to control. This is already a remarkable achievement in scholarship, but Bergholz goes further, investigating how memories of violence can persist or even surge decades after the event, sometimes reinforcing these Manichaean ethnic and political categories. In doing so, his work meaningfully contributes to how we understand the collective memory of trauma. This intervention can hardly be more timely, as nationalized narratives of perpetration and victimhood are hotly contested in Poland, Ukraine, and across Eastern Europe. These achievements distinguished Violence as a Generative Force from a field of highly accomplished books. The selection committee's citation reads in part, "Restrained, humane, and beautifully written, and drawing intelligently on ethnography, psychology, and genocide studies, Violence as a Generative Force deserves to be read not only by Europeanists, but by anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of mass violence." As a student of mass violence, I can confirm that I will reflect on Bergholz's insights for years to come. I actually originally borrowed his book from my friend. It's now mine. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce the James M. Stanford Professor of Genocide and Human Rights Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, and the recipient of the 2019 Laura Shannon Prize, Max Bergholz. He will present a lecture entitled "Telling the Histories of Violence Without Borders." Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks so much for that generous introduction. and thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate your participation. It's a great honor to be here to accept this prestigious prize. And I want to second the thanks that have already been given to the staff at the Nanovic Institute, particularly to the director, Bill Donahue, and to Monica Caro, who has expertly and seamlessly organized everything. It's been a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful to Laura and Michael Shannon for establishing this prize and for their support of the social sciences and humanities, particularly in this particular moment when these subjects and these fields of study are somewhat under attack from various parties in North America. Finally, I'd like to express my gratitude to the members of the selection committee, the jury, for their careful engagement and time in terms of reading my work. So I'm a historian of modern European history, and my main interests are the local dynamics of nationalism, violence, and historical memory. And my primary research sites are what we could call the South Slavic lands, and in particular, the areas today that consist of Bosnia, Herzegovina, Croatia, and Serbia. These are parts of Europe that most historians and history departments in North America do not consider to be of central importance to the telling of the continent's modern history, aside from briefly mentioning their place in explaining the outbreak of the First World War. So on first glance, as Mark said, it might seem strange that I am here today to accept this prize, since many people might assume that my work does not concern the areas and subjects that most people would consider as central to the telling of Europe's modern history. But my book on the dynamics of violence, identity, and memory in a small Balkan community has fortunately won not only the Laura Shannon Prize, but also 4 other prizes, most of which were from organizations with no connection to Balkan or Slavic studies. And this success surprised me and my editor at Cornell University Press, who actually remarked to me back in an email in 2015, when he was still wondering whether he would accept the manuscript for publication. Quote, "If we actually manage to publish this 400-plus page book on the history of a small corner of northwest Bosnia during only a few months of violent history, then you and I will be very lucky to still have our day jobs." So my sense is that my book has been successful not because of a widespread interest in the history of Bosnia, nor because there is some growing imperative in North America to study more generally Balkan history. Rather, the reason would have to be because of the book's more portable findings, and especially its methodological orientations, which I think can be useful to historians and other scholars who study violence in different contexts and not only in Europe. So my lecture today will be less about the specifics of my book and more about what I learned from a methodological standpoint during the decade that I spent researching and writing it. And specifically, I want to reflect this afternoon about 3 issues that arose during my work, all of which are rooted in some way or another in a notion of crossing borders. First, the need to surmount disciplinary provincialism when studying violence. Second, the importance of establishing a sense of place when writing about violence. And third, the challenge of practicing historical empathy when telling histories of violence. Before I turn to a discussion of these subjects, I want to begin with a story about the origins of this book in order to provide a context for these broader ideas. So even though I didn't know it at the time, the moment when the journey of writing this book began was on a warm and sunny afternoon in September 2006. I was in the archive of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo, conducting research for my doctoral dissertation on local struggles over how to remember the intercommunal violence of the Second World War in Yugoslavia. I was searching for a local case study, a third local case study, to go along with those that I had already researched during 2004 and 2005 in Serbia and Croatia. So I was trying to finish my work. I thought I was at the end of my dissertation research. On this afternoon, I was unexpectedly given access to one of the archive's basement storage spaces. The archivists let me in for about 15 minutes after they grew tired of dealing with my constant requests for materials they had difficulty locating. So after all of this research in Serbia and Croatia, I knew what I was looking for when I came to Bosnia. There were a certain set of files related to a veterans organization. These individuals were involved in building monuments and creating physical manifestations of historical memory of war. And the archivists, many of them were new. Some during the war in the 1990s, from 1992 to 1995, had left the country. Some had retired since that time. And so the staff at the archive was new. And they basically told me they couldn't find the files I was looking for. But I also knew from talking with others that the files had not been destroyed. So I kept dropping by the archive every day, wondering if they had found them. And the archivists, I was being politely irritating. And the archivist grew irritated with me. And I heard one day one of the senior, officials for the reading room finally just say, "Let the Bergholz guy down in the basement. I'm tired of seeing his face." And so they took me to the basement and opened the door and turned on a light. I thought the lights would come on. It'd be like maybe 1 or 2 light bulbs in this room coming on instead of all of them. So it was very dim. The archivist handed me a flashlight. And she said, "I think what you're looking for might be down there. You have 15 minutes. And I was staring into this darkness, essentially. And I asked her, "Why only 15 minutes?" And she said, "Because we're going to coffee in 15 minutes with my colleagues. That's all the time you have." So this opportunity was structured by when the coffee break of the day, the morning coffee break was scheduled. While I was sifting through the uncatalogued documents, to which she pointed me toward, with the flashlight, the handwritten words on a handful of blue folders stopped me in my tracks. And they looked almost identical to these folders here. Right here. But the words on them were unusual and caught my eye. Sites of mass executions, 1941 to 1945. And I had stumbled upon a confidential communist government investigation that had been compiled during the first half of the 1980s. So these were relatively new documents. According to the law in Bosnia on the use of archival documents, at least 30 years have to pass from the time a document is generated until it can be placed in the hands of a researcher. So it was 2006, 30 years had not passed. And with that in mind, I took it off the shelf. And I said to the archivist, "Let's go back upstairs." So I wasn't supposed to have access to this report. I brought it to the reading room and I began to read. And the papers inside repeatedly mentioned a town and surrounding community that I had never heard of. Kulin Vakuf, a small town and its surrounding villages, all of which straddle the historic border between present-day northwest Bosnia and Croatia. So just to give you a sense of orientation, this is a map from the 1920s from the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, otherwise known as the First Yugoslavia. And you can see the Kulin Vakuf region. And here's a photograph of the town of Kulin Vakuf here. At the heart of this region is the Una River, which you can see flowing through the center of Kulin Vakuf. Due to a specific content of sediment and the pure quality of the river's water, the Una often appears emerald green, especially when the sun beams down. And this river generally flows along softly. If you stand on the bridge that you see here, spanning its banks in Kulin Vakuf, you can hear it quietly gurgling and bubbling. Here and there, it bursts over spectacular waterfalls. But mostly the Una flows along gently and is visually mesmerizing due to its magnificent colors. The documents in those blue folders told that during 2 days and nights in early September 1941, this stunning natural world had transformed into a site of mass death. The documents indicated that approximately 2,000 people, men, women, and children, quote, of the Muslim population, were killed by their neighbors, who were described as, quote, insurgents and Serbs. These documents offered only a glimpse into this multi-ethnic community's sudden descent into intercommunal violence. but I immediately had a very strong feeling, almost a physical sensation, that I had stumbled upon a story of potentially great significance. And it eventually grew into this book. On the left is the cover of the English edition, which came out in 2016, and on the right is the Bosnian edition, which was published just over a year ago. The major reorientation that began that afternoon, first in the archive's basement and later in the reading room, ultimately dragged me away from my original interest in the local dynamics of remembering violence and pushed me toward the challenge of explaining the causes, dynamics, and effects of local violence. And slowly my interest came to focus on a 48-hour period during which these 2,000 men, women, and children disappeared. I learned that some had been shot to death. Others were butchered with farm tools. Some were drowned in the emerald green waters of the Una River. Others were thrown into the darkness of deep vertical caves. I became fixated on reconstructing and explaining those terrifying 48 hours when this killing took place. Yet doing so pulled me further and further into the past. I soon learned that those 48 hours could not be explained without first reconstructing the destruction of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia in April 1941, and then the subsequent creation of the fascist independent state of Croatia and its policies of ethnic discrimination and violence during the spring and summer of that year. Explaining those transformations led me back to political struggles of the first Yugoslavia during the 1930s and then 1920s, and excavating the dynamics of social conflict and cohesion during the interwar period led me to the period of Austro-Hungarian rule, from 1878 to 1918, and then to the preceding centuries of Ottoman rule, during which the town of Kulin Vakuf was established at the end of the 17th century on a small island in the Una River. So I kept turning back in time in pursuit of evidence. And once I felt like I had excavated nearly everything I could find about the history of this Balkan community, I then switched directions and began writing the story of Kulin Vakuf forward in time, toward the summer of 1941, and finally returning to where I began, to those 48 hours in early September of that year. But doing so presented me with a huge challenge. How to tell the history of this community in which shocking levels of intercommunal violence would soon take place, but without doing so in a deterministic way, as if local residents seemed destined to destroy one another because of nominal cultural differences and something called nationalism. And the best way forward, it seemed to me, was to use the snapshot in those blue folders of the killings in Kulin Vakuf as a micro lens through which to embark on a search for answers to questions of global significance. And the two that frame this book are what causes intercommunal violence among neighbors in multi-ethnic communities, and how does such violence then affect their identities and social relations. So violence as a generative force represents the culmination of my search for answers to these questions. One of my overarching objectives in writing this book was to tell the story of this largely unknown Balkan community in such a way that it might appeal to readers with interest in the dynamics of violence across space and time. As I conducted my field research, as I read secondary literature, and as I began writing, I increasingly felt that a first potentially fruitful way of realizing that objective would be to try to write in the margins of the scholarly disciplines from which I was drawing inspiration. And these included not only the genre of microhistory or local history, but also various subfields within political science, as well as social psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And my main motivation for trying to open up productive space in the borderlands of these disciplines was the challenge I mentioned earlier of finding a way to tell the story of this Balkan community with an acute sense of historical contingency rather than determinism. I came to identify this challenge through my reading of the historiography about mass violence in this part of Europe during 1941. So until recently, historians have devoted little sustained attention to explaining the intercommunal violence that took place in the fascist independent state of Croatia. This was the new state that the Kulan-Vakov region was incorporated into in April of 1941. Here is a map of that state. Among works in the South Slavic languages, a striking characteristic is how the description of violence overwhelmingly substitutes for explanation. Many authors decontextualize killings by stringing together acts of violence against a particular ethnic group from different locations and times, but without accounting for their temporal and geographic variation. And this approach makes it easier to argue for the importance of a single macro factor, such as in this case, a supposedly deeply rooted, almost timeless nationalist ideology as the primary cause of violence. Among historians based outside the Balkans, there have been a number of illuminating studies published during the past decade or so on the history of the NDH, or the independent state of Croatia. When it comes to explaining the causes, dynamics, and effects of intercommunal violence, however, this literature offers surprisingly few answers. Part of the problem is that while this newer work has much to say about life in urban centers and the actions of political elites, it is striking how little we still know about the countryside of the NDH, places like Kulan-Vakov, despite a consensus among scholars that the majority of intercommunal violence from 1941 to 1945 actually took place there. This hole in the literature is perplexing, given the shift in research on violence during the past decade and a half in other contexts, such as South Asia and Africa, as well as other parts of Eastern Europe, in which the local level, especially the countryside, has become a central subject for analysis. Regarding the NDH, part of the problem has to do with the research questions that continue to retain importance. Historians tend to focus on subjects that have long dominated this field, such as how many people were killed in the NDH? Do certain killings constitute genocide? The wartime experience of ethnic groups, and there are other questions and subjects. These questions and subjects have their place, but their continued prominence helps to maintain a certain inward focus in this field. And this provincial perspective is not particular to the historiography of violence in this part of the Balkans. It is a more general feature, to some extent or another, of many historical literatures on various episodes of violence, such as Holocaust studies, the mass killings or genocides in Indonesia and Rwanda, and the destruction of indigenous peoples in the Americas, among other examples. In Balkan historiography, a main consequence of this provincialism has been a surprising lack of engagement with broader scholarly debates, particularly debates in the social science literature on violence, currently taking place about the dynamics of violence in various contexts throughout the world. And lack of engagement with more general questions about the causes, dynamics, and effects of violence has meant that most histories of violence in the specific time and place of my research have been characterized by a striking poverty of conceptual and analytical clarity. To surmount these challenges, I chose to employ a dual approach in the research and writing of my book. On the one hand, I wanted to make a rural community, that is the Kulan-Vakov region, the central lens of analysis. On the other, I wanted to build an analytical bridge between the specific history of this community and debates about the dynamics of violence in various contexts throughout the world. So my challenge was to write a rich microhistory that could engage a number of debates in the field of political violence, but would also avoid getting bogged down in the provincial infighting and historical determinism that is common to many scholars who write about violence in this part of the Balkans. My rough roadmap in charting this new path came in large part from the kinds of books and articles I read during and after my fieldwork. As my dissatisfaction grew with the historiography on intercommunal violence in the Balkans, I found myself reading increasingly outside the discipline of history, in search of more general insights, as well as new perspectives about the dynamics of violence. At first, I think I began moving in this direction almost unconsciously. My intuition told me that I needed to acquire a broader perspective to make sense of and tell the microhistory I was excavating. Engaging with work by political scientists of civil war and anthropologists of pogroms and intercommunal violence, whose research focused on time periods and places far afield from my particular topic, provided me with questions and perspectives that had not occurred to me during my years of immersing myself in the specifics of Balkan history. The studies I read, such as the seminal work, The Logic of Violence in Civil War by the political scientist Stathis Kalivas, noted the frequent and puzzling disjuncture between the macro cleavages of violent conflict and the nature of local violence, especially in the countryside. That insight led me to seek out works by social scientists who have studied what is the often puzzling temporal and geographical variation in instances of local violence, which has been vividly illuminated through micro-comparative research, such as work on pogroms in Poland, lynchings in the United States, and the genocide in Rwanda. This work has helped to generate research on how instances of violence shape prospects for further violence, which I learned more about in recent social science literature on the Spanish Civil War. This scholarship has helped focus attention on discerning the extent to which pre-violence macro cleavages along a political, religious, or economic axis interact with local dynamics in accounting for whether intercommunal violence happens, where it happens or does not, and in what ways. And the focus by these political scientists on the often internal dynamics of violent conflict led me to discover the work of anthropologists of violence, particularly those who study South Asia, such as Veena Das, whose careful local research has suggested that violence may, in fact, dramatically transform perceptions of identities and forms of social categorization in ways that differ strikingly from what existed prior to violent conflict. For me, the chief payoff from engaging with this social science literature was that it began to give my historical writing a focus on posing fresh and compelling questions, many of which began to resemble puzzles that needed to be solved. Why did violence start when and where it did? Why did it stop? How could I explain the presence and absence of violence in the same regions? What exactly transforms a context in which violence seems likely into one in which we see actual violence? By telling my local history of violence as a story that can provide empirically vivid answers to these kinds of questions, I found that my microhistory began to sound like one that had real global significance, which it would not have had without the insights and questions I acquired by reading far outside my discipline. So crossing disciplinary borders and increasing engagement with the social sciences can bring enhanced analytical clarity when telling histories of violence. But venturing down this path also means that historians need to remain vigilant about how to keep their readers reading, bombarding them with paragraphs full of social science jargon, statistical methods, mathematical equations, charts, and graphs can be an effective way to compel most people who might be willing to pick up our books to put them down very quickly and perhaps never return. So another major challenge when telling histories of violence concerns how to create and especially maintain a compelling bond between our readers and the often highly disturbing stories we seek to tell. On first glance, this challenge may not appear to be significant. After all, stories of violence, from distant history to today's news, tend to immediately attract people's attention. Think of the execution videos that members of ISIS have produced during the past years, and the attention they have drawn, as well as the recent acts of mass violence by adherents of the white power movement, such as the shootings in the synagogue in Pittsburgh and in 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. But stories of violence also often immediately create some kind of almost unbridgeable border between those who read or hear about such stories and those who are participants in them. Histories of violence, and especially extreme manifestations of cruelty, simultaneously attract attention and alienate our readers, who are drawn to witnessing the horror of violence, but often recoil from delving too deeply or even at all into understanding its causes and dynamics. One way I found to try and remove this border between the story I sought to tell in my book and my potential readers was to make use of what the historian Kate Brown has called the transformational power of being there. Among other books, Kate Brown has written Plutopia, which she published in 2013. This is a path-breaking social history of communities that evolved in the shadow of nuclear power facilities in the United States and Soviet Union. Given the sensitivity of her subject, archival documents were often scarce, but she found that the natural and human landscape, while vast and unstructured for traditional historical research when compared to formal institutions like archives and libraries, could nonetheless serve as very effective sources if she was capable of seeing them as such. In this way, the experience of being there opened up new vistas and perspectives for historical explanation, which would have been missed if she had stayed within the confines of traditional research institutions. This notion, the transformational power of being there, was something that happened to me in a certain way during my fieldwork on my book, even though I only read Brown's work on this subject many years later. Due to a number of reasons, such as working in a highly divided post-conflict society like Bosnia and Herzegovina, my archival research was sometimes hampered, and I found myself without access to formal research institutions for significant periods of time. This initially highly frustrating situation led me to seek out insights from the landscape where the story I was trying to tell took place, and from the people I encountered there. I took this photograph during the first week of October 2008. At the time, I was in the town of Bihać in northwest Bosnia, struggling to gain access to that region's archive. My written requests for permission to conduct research were languishing in huge piles of paper in various ministries. Again, I visited the archive regularly to politely inquire about the progress of my request, and each time the director invented new reasons why documents could not be made available to me. Whenever I would leave his office, I could immediately hear him cursing me and my relatives in multiple and extremely colorful ways. During this time, I felt that my research had hit a brick wall. So one chilly morning, I boarded a local bus to Kulinvakov, which took me far from the archive director and his friends in the ministries, who seemed to be trying and succeeding to block my research. Once I arrived, I borrowed an old bicycle, which belonged to the son of a woman whom I had interviewed during the previous weeks. I set off through the fog along the Una River Valley on my way to a village called Martinbrod, about 15 kilometers down this road. I can still clearly remember the sounds of the Una as its waters gurgled and bubbled while I pedaled across the bridge spanning its banks in Kulinvakov. I turned right, and after a kilometer, the paved road abruptly ended. My tires bounced off of pebbles, which rattled and shook me. The smell of recently burned fields permeated the air. Halfway to Martinbrod, the sun broke through this mist, lighting up the fall colors of the trees lining the valley and sparkling on the emerald green waters of the Una River. Once or twice, a car passed me going too fast. This enveloped me in a cloud of dust, which hung in the air without dissipating. Here and there, I caught sight of a house from the road. I saw elderly people tending their sheep and goats. I heard the faint noise of bells clanging around their necks as they grazed. This mingled with the sound of their owners using hatchets to split logs, which combined with the popping of stones as I pedaled forward, dodging water-filled craters on the road. At several points, I stopped and took photographs. A still-destroyed bridge from the 1992 to 1995 war. Fading graffiti on a house left by the warring factions of those years. And the emerald green waters of the Una. I had no phone, and almost no one knew where I was. I remember quietly saying to myself at one point as I scanned the landscape, "There's nothing else I'd rather be doing, and nowhere else I'd rather be." My excitement at probing this world as far as my limits as a historian would allow contrasted sharply with my knowledge of the terrifying history of this dusty road. This was the same road along which were marched approximately 400 to 420 men and boys on the evening of September 7th, 1941. Like me, they could see the mesmerizing emerald green waters of the Una from various junctures as they traveled south, one step at a time, toward Martinbrod. They were in a long column, lined up two across, as armed insurgents marched them forward. It was in Martinbrod, after a sleepless night, that two groups of insurgents faced off against each other on the morning of September 8th. One smaller group was composed of those who wanted to free most of these prisoners, who also happened to be their neighbors. The other, which was much larger, was made up of those who demanded that all the prisoners be killed. There was a physical altercation between these two groups, and the latter prevailed. After binding the prisoners' hands with wire, these insurgents took the men and boys in small groups about 3 kilometers up a winding road. As the road turned sharply left toward a village, they turned right into a meadow, walked about 30 meters, and brought the prisoners to the edge of a vertical cave. It was there that they cut each prisoner's throat and then dumped the bodies into the darkness. Only one man managed to get his hands free and escape. The remains of the rest are still at the bottom of this cave today. It was not until a blisteringly hot summer afternoon in 2014 that I, along with the woman who lent me the bicycle in 2008 and a local police officer, managed to locate this cave. This is what it looked like as we crossed the meadow from a distance, just on the edge of this forest. And this is what it looked like as we stared down into it. I held onto a tree and stared into its darkness. I then dropped a stone, which made a clicking sound as it bounced from side to side for a few seconds before hitting the bottom. I remember I immediately felt very cold, even though the air temperature that afternoon was at least 95 degrees. I narrate these moments during my fieldwork to pose several questions that I think all scholars of violence should consider. Can the experience of being there, as Kate Brown has called it, help us restructure the simultaneous magnetic attraction and enormous gulf that usually occur when we confront our readers with histories of violence? Can the effort taken to convey a sensual portrait of a place help dispel, at least to some extent, the flood of preconceived notions that race into readers' minds about how and why people have engaged in violence, which creates a gulf, and for many, an almost an unbridgeable border between them and the histories we seek to tell? Can incorporating experiences of being there help us engage readers with our stories in ways that convey humanity, and thus suggest our collective interconnectedness across space and time, including our common humanity with those caught up in episodes of past violence, and even with those who have committed acts of violence? The third and final way to try and cross the borders that arise when we seek to tell histories of violence is to reflect about our capacity and especially our willingness to practice historical empathy. This is a photograph taken from a bridge in Kulen Vakuf, not the large bridge in the photo of the town that I showed earlier, but a bridge that spans a small gorge about 1 kilometer north of town. This is a place where in 1941, a sizable group of women and children were trapped, standing on this bridge. And on either side, they were being chased by groups of peasants and insurgents who were armed with rifles, but more so with axes, clubs, and rocks. And they were intent on killing these women and children. The women turned left and saw there was no way out, and they turned right and they saw there was no way out. And so they began picking up their children and throwing them over the bridge into the water, and then threw themselves into the water. And none of these people could swim. And so most drowned. And in a few cases, some of them were washed downstream, down the river a few hundred meters, and managed to hold onto trees once they passed through this gorge and pulled themselves out and realized that their children were gone. And in several cases, the women then ran and threw themselves back into the water and committed suicide. I was in Kulen Vakuf of May this year, and I walked to this bridge with a friend. And for the first time, I shot a short video of it. Watching it can help us imagine what it might have felt like to the women and children in 1941 as they gazed into the water before jumping to their deaths. I recount this terrifying story from my book, and I show you this short video because I think they can help us better appreciate the immense challenge of practicing historical empathy when we seek to tell histories of violence. Most scholars, including myself, would agree about the necessity of extending as much empathy as possible when telling the history of the victims of this violence on the bridge in Kulen Vakuf. But there is another challenge here, which most scholars of violence, either implicitly or explicitly, would balk at taking on. In my book, after narrating the harrowing experience of what took place on and nearby this bridge, I wrote the following sentence at the beginning of the next paragraph. Quote, "Although this level of cruelty is shocking, we should resist the urge to see it as incomprehensible and instead rise to the challenge of discerning its internal logic." End quote. Here I'm signaling my intention to try and travel into the world of those who committed this violence, to see them as human beings like us, and to attempt to explain why they did what they did from their point of view. I go on to discuss how these killings were fueled by an immense desire for revenge among the insurgents and peasants, many of whose families and villages had been destroyed during the previous weeks by some of the male relatives of those women and children on the bridge. I suggest that this desire for revenge was about more than simply getting even. Here, total obliteration of the perceived enemy was the primary objective, because it alone held the capacity to counteract the pain and sense of powerlessness previously felt by these revenge seekers. When I received the anonymous readers' reports from Cornell University Press about my book manuscript, one of the readers reacted to this paragraph in the following way. Quote, "You suggest that this disturbing behavior makes sense if we view it as intimately connected to fulfilling this desire for revenge. But it is not spelled out why we should view it from this perspective, which is ultimately the perspective of the perpetrators of this violence." End quote. Out of all the comments that this reviewer wrote, which totaled nearly 9,000 words of thoughtful feedback, this sentence is among those that stayed in the forefront of my mind as I revised my book. It seems to me that my effort to tell part of this history by trying to walk in the shoes of some of the perpetrators struck a nerve with this reviewer. So much so that the reviewer even questioned why we should try and tell this history from the perspective of those who committed such exceptionally cruel acts of violence. To me, this reaction highlights a challenge that every scholar of violence eventually has to face head on. In my teaching, I call it the point at which we choose to get off the bus that we are traveling on into the world of violence when we choose to study this phenomenon. All of us have a point when, so to speak, we no longer wish to travel any further. And so we stand up and we ask the driver to pull over and stop so we can disembark. For most scholars, this stop can be found somewhere around the area when we come upon the world where the perpetrators of violence live. And we have to choose how empathetic we wish to be when we encounter their perspectives and the challenge of explaining their behavior. Some scholars have referred to this choice as the central dilemma of researching what could be called repellent or unloved groups. Can we extend to them the same level of empathy and sensitivity that we would offer to their victims? Are we willing to rise to the challenge, to use the words of Viet Thanh Nguyen in his book, Nothing Ever Dies, of explaining, quote, how the inhuman inhabits the human? In spite of our responsibility as historians to rigorously explain rather than judge human behavior, the answer that many scholars offer to this question, either explicitly or more often implicitly, is no. For many who write about violence, there are humans in the past who deserve our empathy, and inhumans who do not. Yet in making such a distinction, we place yet another major border between the histories of violence we seek to tell and our readers. For those of us who believe that transcending this border is a critical challenge we have to take on, then we may need to consider crossing another border and venture outside the scholarly world in search of inspiration and methods. Here I'm thinking of what can be learned by closely engaging with what artists have accomplished in recent years with regard to pushing the limits of practicing historical empathy when examining the subject of violence. Now, this topic could take up an entire lecture, but before I finish, I'd like to briefly mention one recent work of artistic creation that has been highly influential on my thinking as a historian of violence. This is the 2003 play by Wadi Mawad called Incendie, or Scorched, as it's been translated into English. This play was made into a 2010 film directed by the same title, which was directed by Denis Villeneuve. So Incendie is a complex story, but what struck me about it the most is its astonishingly radical level of empathy for all characters who have committed and been subjected to acts of extreme violence. In this play and film, these two categories are completely merged. Those who are subjected to extreme violence then go on to commit acts of extreme violence. This is a still photo from one of the film's main characters, Nihad. He begins his life in trauma. His mother, nominally Christian, is forced to give him away immediately after giving birth due to the taboo nature in her village of her relationship with Nihad's father, a nominal Muslim. Nihad is sent to an orphanage, which is then bombed during his country's civil war. He and the other boys he lives with are taken by one of the warring factions and raised to become child soldiers, the first steps of which can be seen here in the photograph with his head being shaved. As the civil war unfolds, Nihad searches for his mother, but he is transformed by the ongoing violence and becomes an expert sniper, executing other child soldiers. He is captured by the opposing side, which recognizes his skill as a practitioner of violence. He changes his name to Abu Tariq and becomes a terrifying torturer in a prison. In the story of Nihad to Abu Tariq, we are confronted with the tragic victimization of an infant and child, and then the emergence of a frightening perpetrator, yet we never leave the same person. This play and film confront us with sensitive portrayals of such individuals' most intimate struggles, without harsh judgment or comfortable moralizing. Instead, we are constantly challenged to see them as people like us, who are extremely vulnerable to being hurt, and who also have a terrifying capacity to hurt others. This sensibility differs dramatically from the typical way that most scholars approach the telling of histories of violence, in which they generally divide people into exclusive categories of perpetrators and victims, into the evil and innocent, with only the latter really deserving our empathy. Yet the play Incendie confronts us with a radical challenge. If we really want to understand history, then we must approach all perspectives of those involved in violence with the same level of empathy. As Nihad's mother writes in a letter to her children when imagining a way forward with regard to engaging with the violent past, quote, "Now history must be reconstructed. History is in ruins. Gently console every shred. Gently cure every moment. Gently rock every image." Such words, especially the imperative approaching the past gently and considering every shred and image, challenges scholars to make crossing the normally sealed borders between victims and perpetrators a central intervention of their work. Here we can look again to the writing of Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose reflections about the responsibility of the artist are highly instructive to scholars of violence. He insists that artists must strive to, quote, see across all kinds of borders, beginning with those that separate selves from others. For artists, politics should ultimately be about abolishing sides, venturing into the no man's land between trenches, borders, and camps. We need an art that celebrates the humanity of all sides and acknowledges the inhumanity of all sides, including that of our own, end quote. My argument is that we also need a scholarship of violence in which we seek to see across borders and in which we approach the study of humanity and inhumanity by acknowledging that they are, in fact, two sides of the same coin. In the end, the notion in the title of my lecture today of telling histories of violence without borders challenges us to make a number of moves that ultimately mean we have to consider leaving our comfort zones as scholars of violence. The first asks us to read far outside our often provincial disciplinary boundaries in pursuit of new perspectives and questions that can open up fresh vistas for explanatory and analytical clarity. The second asks us to engage deeply with the physical and human landscapes where the stories we seek to tell took place, and to develop a sensual understanding of those landscapes, which can seep into our writing so as to narrow the border between our readers in the present day and our stories of violence in the past. The third and final move asks us to extend historical empathy as far as we possibly can, to try and walk in the shoes of all people caught up in episodes of violence. In so doing, we need to ask ourselves hard questions about what, at the end of the day, we are trying to accomplish in telling histories of violence. Are we content to memorialize the violent past? Do we wish to moralize about it? Is the study of violence to be used primarily as a weapon in never-ending battles of identity politics? Or do we have our eyes squarely focused on the challenge of explaining violence while conveying as much humanity as possible of all the people whose stories we have given ourselves the right to tell? Our answers to these questions will ultimately determine whether we wish to try and travel into the world of violence with an eye on crossing these seemingly uncrossable borders, or remain where we are, as scholars of violence who prefer to feel safe on the other side of the many borders that divide us from the subject we claim to know best. Thank you.
Care of the mic, but did you want to MC the Q&A?
Sure. I don't have a mic, but I think I can just speak loudly. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, so we have some time for questions and answers. We have a little tradition here at the Nanovic Institute that we like to open the field to questions first to any students in the audience. So we'll start there. Great, Shinjini.
This is my turn.
Thank you so much for the fascinating and transformative lecture. I have a question for your approach to the archive. So when you are incorporating the sense of being there and constructing historical empathy, what happens when there are gaps and silences in the archives? Then do you employ something like Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation, or do you have your own methodology for that?
That's a great question. It's this story in particular, particularly when doing this kind of local research, I mean, you come up against vast silences. And so, I mean, this is one of the ways in which being there, I think, can be very useful. I can give an example from the book. I did not have actual sources to talk about the movements of certain groups of people from one place to another. And I wanted to include storytelling dynamics about how people move through the region. So one of the things I was able to include would be my own sense of what those same paths were like, what they looked like, what they felt like, what they smelled like. And I didn't try and project those images into the past, but I said, here is what, I wrote essentially talking about here is what they must have seen what it would have looked like as they moved, for example, alongside a river and came to a fork in the road, and the choice was to either go right past the train station, which was full of bodies that had been killed in the previous weeks, or go left and cut across the gorge that you saw. And so elements like that are not fabrications. They are, in fact, trying to take that experience of being there and fill in those gaps in a way that is true to the historical record without actually speaking on behalf of actors in the past. I mean, this is one of the reasons why an ethnographic and anthropological approach by historians is, I think, critical, which is why the archive itself, while there are silences, the archive itself cannot be the main destination. It's a destination in historical research, but can't be the only destination. I would not have been able to write this book in the way that I did without spending a significant amount of time breathing the air in the region. And so, without having gone too far in that direction in the book, in certain moments I could feel that experience allowing me to approach the silences in a creative way that I think would still maintain integrity of the historical record, but without simply having to say, we have no sources and therefore there's nothing to say. Because I wanted to have the text have some kind of pulse to it, which is why I'm a big believer in this multidisciplinary approach. It really transformed me as a writer, not just as a historian. Thanks for your question.
Jake.
Hi, thank you so much for a really engaging talk.
Thanks.
So I am also a historian of violence, and something that I find myself running into pretty consistently is this struggle to draw the line between historical empathy and trying to read the minds of my historical subjects. So I wonder if you could possibly reflect on that. At what point are we crossing the line into speculation and potentially overstepping our bounds?
It's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer for you. I mean, I think it all depends on the kind of evidence that's available in terms of how far we can go into the world of perpetrators, and particularly those who've committed, and to be honest, anyone who's been caught up in acts of violence, whether they're perpetrator / victim, in other words, that identity can be held by the same person, or those who are witnesses, anyone involved. I think deep understanding of the historical context, reading and chasing down the sources, in an all-out effort to acquire every shred of evidence, is the only way to approach reasoned, sensitive speculation, which is sometimes, when we run out of evidence, we can begin to pose potential hypotheses. It may have been about this. This factor may have been involved. By constantly acknowledging at the same time that we lack definitive evidence. And even when the evidence seems direct, like in cases with much more recent instances of violence like the genocide in Rwanda, if you've ever read the interview transcripts that Scott Strauss has collected in the book Intimate Enemy, where he went to prisons and talked with individuals. I mean, he literally is able to do what I was never able to do in my book, which is to say, why did you kill? And the answer he gets is very unsatisfying. And so he says, I don't understand. And the person answers back, I can't make you understand. And so, I mean, these are moments where I think in a sense, sometimes from there we can move into some kind of reasoned speculation using different kinds of theories. Comparative work can be useful. Do we see similarities? It allows us to approach reasoned speculation. But sometimes beyond that, the power is actually to step back and acknowledge where the limitation is and how far, and where we can't go any further. Yeah.
Thank you for your very vivid and convincing story. I'm a student of sociology, so without giving up the full story of your book, could you please talk a little bit more about what are the economic, social, or political factors contributing to this violence?
Sure. Just in a few words, I think what's fascinating about this book and the story of what was fascinating to me about researching this book, I should say, is that what I expected to see was not supported by the evidence that I found. So I thought, given the nature of this violence in which people were killed along the lines of their perceived cultural identity, that cultural cleavages must have been very deep in this society, and that nationalist ideologies and political parties organized along such lines must have been strong and must have had large-scale support in the region. And I didn't find that at all. Instead, what I discovered is that the earthquake of first the invasion by outside powers and the destruction of this country upended the previous social order, which allowed a small group of extremists to come to power. And in order for them to mobilize power, that is to say human power or manpower, women power, people in the regions, they had to offer concrete incentives. And allowing people in the regions to plunder and steal from their neighbors and resolve local squabbles that had dragged on for decades, if not longer, was compelling to a very small number of people. What's fascinating here is that the initial group of perpetrators that started these waves of violence was about 111 individuals. 111 individuals. So it was not, and none of these individuals had been involved in any of the extremist organizations prior to this violence. In other words, their motivation for involving themselves had much more to do with personal squabbles and material incentives. But they found common ground with those who took power in this region who were much more politically motivated. So there's an economic component, there's a kind of a personal vendetta component, as well as a political ideological component. And the story really shows that we can't understand how violence takes place to this extent in small regions without looking at both the macro level matters, but how the micro level becomes embedded and takes part in macro level policies has to be researched from the ground up, not simply used to illustrate policies from the top. That's what was different in this story. The previous histories of this region usually use the localities to illustrate decisions taken in the center. And what I found here is that in the periphery, we come up with a completely different story if we take the time to find the sources and listen to what people have to say. Other than that, the book is available outside if you're interested in reading it. And there's a Bosnian edition as well. So.
I think Alex had a question.
That was something I was something I was very curious about. I want to come back to your empathy topic, but the combination of the empathy and the being there. So you're talking about the empathy with the perpetrators. Were there any personal experiences or encounters you had with people that got you thinking about that?
Yeah.
When you said somebody described someone, or you had a conversation and said, wow, this is what one of the perpetrators must have been like? Or is there something of that nature that influenced your thinking?
In fact, there was a moment where I think I really became fascinated with this subject and realized how much work I still had to do. Like the challenge that I laid out at the end of my lecture is a challenge that was enormous and is enormous for me. So I don't say it. I don't invite others to take up that challenge without also acknowledging. I acknowledge that it's a very demanding one for me. The moment when I felt the great demand of it was when I went to this village, Martinbrod. Not the time where I was writing this time, but a few years later, I went back and forth to this village many, many times. And I was speaking with an individual there, and he became very clear to me that in 1992, he had been involved in the ethnic cleansing of Kulan Vakuf. In other words, the attack in 1992, the entire Muslim population in this region was expelled. And so this individual who had offered me coffee, and I was sitting in his kitchen, and we were talking about history, and we were talking about life in the region. I was sitting there talking with someone who had carried out war crimes 15 kilometers up the road. And I began to feel all kinds of feelings sitting there, from feelings of fear to feelings of fascination to ethical dilemmas. And I realized that if I want to actually tell histories of violence, I have to be able to find a way to listen sensitively to a person's experience on a side that does not necessarily conform to my moral universe. And that was a moment where I felt the gravity of that challenge, because I did not like being there at that moment with that individual. It felt very uncomfortable to me. And I thought to myself, later I thought to myself, how will I actually write a history when I can't engage with that perspective? And I can't approach that perspective with some sort of sensitivity. So that's where I think I began to appreciate the great challenge of probing the world of the perpetrator and seeing, trying to walk in that person's shoes as much as possible.
If I might just ask a real quick follow-up to that. So was your feeling at that moment that this guy did what he did because he's different from me, or he became different from me because he did what he did?
All of that, I think.
Those are two different things.
Well, to me, it was a number of different thoughts that came through my mind. But in general, the general feeling I had at that moment was not even that complex, which is I felt extremely uncomfortable being near people that had engaged in acts of violence. At that moment, I could feel, even though I was writing a history of violence, when I actually came that close to an individual who had admitted to me that he had carried out such acts without going into great detail, I could feel my level of discomfort. And so, I mean, that was really where, and this happened to me multiple times. This was the first time it happened. There were other times after that. And I think it's something that one has to make a commitment to acknowledging, engaging with, and it's a very complex terrain on which to be. I've had people admit things to me that, you know, it's without being able to verify whether it's true or not, which would make them very much susceptible to being taken to the War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague. And so these are real dilemmas that a researcher like myself and others face when doing this kind of work. And I'm not sure there's always a right approach in these moments. But in general, as I've finished the book and as I've stepped back and as I've thought about what makes this book, what I think gives this book a different quality than other studies of violence, is perhaps not a successful effort, but nonetheless a strenuous effort at trying to tell the story through the eyes of as many people as possible without putting certain groups into one-dimensional categories of evil individuals. As I was saying in the class when we were talking with your students the other day, this is one of the reasons why to me, the most important review written of the book, which is by the Croatian writer, or I should say the Bosnian writer and literary critic Milenko Jergovic. He wrote a long review of the book earlier this year. And at the end, he simply said, "It is unbelievable how unacceptable this book is to all of us," as a compliment. And I think that to me was some kind of confirmation that I pushed hard in this direction and had some kind of success. But it's one that is, I think, the greatest challenge in engaging with this work. And it needs to be talked about and acknowledged more. And I think it's one of the key ways that the field will advance further by extending the number of perspectives that we can engage with sensitively as far as possible.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. And I'm from Norway, and I'm here at the Center for Advanced Study. I was here last year at Nanovic. And I was a politician working in the Balkans after the war. And I remember a French commander telling me that the way the ethnic cleansing really started, the dynamics was that the Tigers, Arkan, and these types, paramilitaries, would go into a village and tell one person to kill his neighbor by a knife or something very similar, so that there would be a dynamic of violence unleashed. And the commander said, once you have killed once, you have overstepped a border, you cannot return in a way to your old self. And then there is both, in a way, a license to kill for many people there, and there is also this sort of dehumanization of yourself, so you can go on killing. So we said this is a well-known way of instigating this kind of civil war violence, and this is what was used in Bosnia deliberately. Mm-hmm. And that is in a way tells us that religion, ethnicity, these things that were not really causal in any way. It was quite a much more primitive kind of dynamic. Had nothing to do with sort of rational reasons or irrational reasons. There was no reason in a way. It was simply the rules were changed in a gruesome way in local communities, and then people would have to take sides. That's of course military psychology in a way, but your comments on that, was that perhaps what happened in this village?
Well, I'll say a few things. One, while I'm also as a historian and scholar of this region, I certainly have followed and pay close attention to writing and discussions about the most recent conflict in the 1990s. But I'm one who believes that we need to draw a real distinction between comparing the two conflicts too closely. Each conflict has its own historical dynamics, its own context, its own causal mechanisms, and I certainly, in the region, there's easy talk about saying, 1992 to 1995 was simply just finishing 1941 to 1945, and I don't subscribe to that view. But at the same time, because in my book I try to illuminate certain dynamics of violence that I think compare and connect across contexts, across space and time, in that sense, it's in the title of the book. Violence is, in many ways, in multiple ways, not simply one way, in multiple ways, a generative force. Once an individual, for whatever reason, commits an act of violence within that context, whether it's a household, or whether it's a village, or some wider context, that individual and the others who are subjected to that violence are transformed very rapidly. And I think appreciating that idea allows us to take more seriously the role of historical contingency and looking at events hour by hour, minute by minute, day by day, rather than how these type of conflicts are often written about in the media, or from a more macro analytical standpoint, which is to say, well, it seems as if cultural criteria mattered in this conflict, therefore those cleavages must have mattered. Rather than work backward with that understanding toward the past, it's better to go to that moment, find the evidence, reconstruct what happened, and then work up to a theory. Again, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, to tell the story forward in time, rather than project backward our understanding, our perhaps simplistic understanding backward. But that's very difficult, especially when conflicts continue to be so politicized and people are so emotionally connected to advocating on behalf of one side or the other. In that sense, the conflicts continue on long after the actual violence stops, and that is the case in this part of the world today. The conflicts are still being fought over through not so much through physical violence, but through works of history, through the media, through commemorations, through street signs, through the way people talk to each other. The language that's used to describe the conflict is still a huge a debate for people. Every single word matters. So again, I think the best way forward for historians, not just in this part of the world, but in the region as well, it's one of the reasons why I worked so hard to translate the book as fast as possible and have a Bosnian edition printed, was to have it be sitting there waiting for a younger group of historians to come along and perhaps find some way forward that's different. Whether they like it or don't like it, that's okay, but perhaps a way that's different from the world in which they live in now, which says we first need to gather the evidence and look at what happened day by day, rather than use these preconceived notions to already come to history with our own conclusions ready to begin with.
I think we might have time for one more question.
I'm going to take one question myself, but is there somebody else here? Well, then I'll give myself that privilege. Max, I want to also thank you for a really great lecture. Beautifully written, beautifully delivered, in a manner that was just clear that you cared about us understanding it. And I can imagine you're a great teacher.
Thanks.
I envy your students.
Thank you.
So I worked in the area of Holocaust studies, and during your talk, especially during the last third, I was trying to think about how to apply that. I'm sure you thought about it as well. And 2 points in particular come to mind. One is the importance of place. Monica and I visited a camp outside of Lublin, Majdanek, and there too the question arose, what is the importance of place? What do we gain? I take students to Sachsenhausen, to Auschwitz, and various places. And I'm frankly divided. Sometimes I think we do, and sometimes I'm in despair, wondering what did I learn, what can I help them learn? Yeah. And I know it's not just about camps, it could be other places. I was convinced when you talked about it, but still befuddled with my own experience. So that's number one. The other thing is the much harder challenge, which I think you really discussed delicately and with great sophistication, and that is about bringing humanity to our subject matter, including to the perpetrators. Well, in the area of Holocaust studies, that's a huge problem, in part because of the way the field developed in the 80s and 90s. It was dominated by survivors, and it was simply taboo. to have much compassion or any compassion for perpetrators. And then, when we began to see things a little bit more differentiatedly, and with the discovery and the attention to Primo Levi, et cetera, you saw nuance, but it was then Jews who were seen as perpetrators and victims, but not so much Germans. They would say, well, oh yes, sometimes Germans were protected, and then sometimes they wouldn't be. But that was about the extent of it. So in both areas, the place and the compassion for perpetrators, I would welcome some insight, and I understand that those are huge questions.
Sure.
But maybe I could just ask you to start us out a little bit.
Sure, I'll say a few more words. These are obviously two subjects they came to my mind when I began to try and think, as the book won awards that I didn't expect it to win. I tried to think, why? What is interesting here to readers who may not have ever thought about Bosnia ever, and don't really care much about that part of the world, yet something here is new and something here is exciting. And I think, two of the subjects, the two subjects you mentioned, I think are two elements that are in the book that I'm not sure there's one way to engage with them. I mean, the whole business of place, I'm reminded back to one of my great teachers. I was talking with some graduate students in public affairs this morning about one of my great professors who was a woman from Ukraine. And I ran into her on the street once when I was an undergraduate student, and she was smoking a cigarette in this kind of cloud of smoke. And I had just written a paper, and it was a class in Russian intellectual history, and about Dostoevsky, and she complimented me on the paper, and then she kind of just looked at me and said, "When are you going there?" What do you mean? When are you going to Russia? You don't know anything about that place until you breathe its air. Go. And then kind of took another cigarette drag and walked away. And this was 20 years ago, and I still remember this vividly. And I think it drove me in certain ways toward anthropology without studying anthropology, at least as a student and as a graduate student, but in that direction, because I really felt like in order to tell this story in a new way, the place had to somehow become an actor. And that somehow I had to make this place feel like somewhere that we all could go or would like to go. And that therefore the people, in that sense, if the place appeals to us in some way and the place feels like something we can imagine and feel and smell and hear, then the experience that I'm now going to talk about, which is terrifying and perplexing, feels less far away, even if it's just this much. And it's an approach that I think can be useful. It's not simply just window dressing. It's not simply just color or detail added. It's a real commitment to try and narrow that gap, to cross that border, to allow us not to simply see violence, terrible violence, either at camps or in the countryside of Bosnia as somewhere happening out there in a world. If that behavior is unfathomable, then the world is unfathomable. But if the world is fathomable, then perhaps we can approach the behavior with a greater degree of sensitivity. And that leads us to the second subject, the whole issue of historical empathy, which again is one that I try to meditate on and think about as I prepared this lecture. And I think it's one of the things, it's certainly in the field of Balkan studies, this element of the book is new. This history that I've written about in this book is usually told in the part of the world where this history has taken place, is told as three distinct histories. There is the history of killing of people considered to be Muslims, and that story is told completely divorced from context with any of the other actors. There is the history of people considered to be Serbs, told divorced from any other context, and people considered to be Croat Catholics. And that is because people are not willing to actually think about human relationships, connections, and the ways in which one act is connected to other acts, and the way in which one neighbor is connected to another neighbor. That when suffering takes place, somehow the urge to memorialize, to remember in the service of identity politics, in other words, not to remember for peace, but to remember so as to never forget, to make sure those people never do it to us again, is, in a sense, building a wall in terms of practicing historical empathy. And so I think there isn't necessarily a magic solution, but one of the key elements is simply to have a willingness to tell the story, to try and devote some space to the other side, to consider that person on the other side not as a black box, as an evil person, but as a person just like you or me. And to at least attempt to think about that person's hopes, fears, dreams, and horrific actions, but not just the latter. It's a great challenge. It is the great challenge. And as you point out, in Holocaust studies, as huge as that field is, it is a gaping hole in that field, aside from a few key works, Christopher Browning's work, for example. But it's one that still, I think, we're waiting for another generation of historians to really bring this approach to that field in some serious way.
That's great. Thank you. Now, you can't leave until we actually, Monica's afraid I'm going to forget to do this, but I won't. The myth is that the $10,000 check is sewn into the back. I'm not sure if that's really true. But I do want to just take a moment to say that what we witnessed today, I think makes it clear why you are so deserving of this award. We at this university talk a lot about mission, and we just saw a young scholar, a young colleague, who combines great integrity and compassion and morality, brings all that to his subject matter, and explains the importance of the humanity in this story. I am deeply moved, and I'm deeply grateful that you wrote this book, and I'm so glad you're here to accept this award. Congratulations.
Thank you.